Hello, welcome to Christ Over Coffee. This is Pastor Chris Byers of Good Shepherd Lutheran Church for another week of Christ Over Coffee. I hope you had a good week this past week, but I just wanted to touch base for this week's Christ Over Coffee. Continuing on, I'm going to get my screen a little better there. Continuing on as we look to moving through the book of Job, I thought would be a good opportunity to go through. Last week we went through the first chapter of Job, and we went through and talked about how the formation of this now. One thing that I didn't bring up here, and I thought about this after the fact, is one of these wonderful extra biblical writings that's out there on Job. It's actually an intertestamental writing. What that means is it was written between the Old Testament's completion and the New Testament at the time when there was a lot of Greek thought that was entering into the Jewish life, the people of Israel at that time, and that was Hellenism which is Greek, was big at the time. So, and there was this really interesting writing that came out at this time. It's never been considered truly biblical in the sense it's not a part of the canon. It's never been something that was looked at by Jews or the priests at the day as being a really valid depiction of Job, but it kind of gives some insight of some of the stories that were going on in the time, and also how maybe some of the people at the time of the intertestamental period were writing about Job, trying to understand this character. Who is Job? Where was he? In this, it's in what's called the Pseudepigrapha, and it's in the apocalyptic writings and some of those wisdom writings at the time. And it's called the Testament of Job. And what it does is it's a story of Job sharing with his children, not the ones, of course, who had died, but the children. As you read to the end of Job, he has his family restored. He has children. And he is telling his children as he is ill about his travails and why he became Job. Prior to this, he was known as Jobab. He was a descendant of Jacob. He actually was a descendant from Esau. So, and he ended up marrying a descendant of Jacob after. So he speaks of that, but his first wife, who they do name in this testament Citis or Citus, is also named here, and it's really interesting. So I'm going to go to my Logos, and I'm going to show you kind of a little bit about this here. When we're reading over this is the speech on his wife. It really starts off interestingly. Testament of Job, about the 1st century B.C. to 1st century A.D. is what it says there. The prologue here is he's fallen ill, and he is telling his children about what had happened prior to their birth, and how he had been before he met his second wife, and really his first wife, Citus, is really a tragic character here. Let's see here, Testament of Job, 1st century. Let me scroll down here because let's start here. The title, the book of the words of Job, the one called Jobab. Setting on the day when having fallen ill, he began to settle his affairs. He called his 7 sons and 3 daughters, and it gives names to these children that were born to him. The second family that God had blessed him with, whose names are Tursi, Koros, Hayan, Nike, Phoros, Fife, Frun, Hemera, Acacia, and Almatheus horn. And he called them all together, "Gather round, my children, gather round me, so that I may show you the things which the Lord did with me and all the things which have happened to me." It kind of actually also starts on in here of why, because he is from, I am your father Job, fully engaged in endurance, but you are a chosen on a race from the seed of Jacob, the father of your mother. For I am from the sons of Esau, the brother of Jacob, of whom is your mother Dinah, from whom I begot you. My former wife died with the other 10 children in a bitter death. So hear me, children. I will show you the things which have befallen me. So we go through in the first one. In the beginning, it kind of covers why this conversation happened with the counsel of the Lord, the Satan, who did that. And here, what they argue on is there's a revealing angel, and that reveals to him this. He lived next to a temple, and reveals to him all the idolatry that was going on in this temple. And this angel gives him a warning, saying, because it troubles him and it troubles his spirit, because he constantly saw whole burnt offerings being offered there. And is this really the God who made heaven and earth, the sea too, and our very selves? How shall you know, it says here. And he finds out it's wrong. And he wants to destroy this temple, because if you're not worshiping the true God, then you need to make sure that you worship that. The angel says, I'll give you the power to do that. However, you're going to suffer because of it, because you're going to take upon yourself the wrath of the Satan. And it talks about in here, tells him of the impending calamities. Job destroys it, but then with 50 youths, and destroys that temple. So then we find here is this Satan's attack follows afterwards, where Satan comes as disguises himself as a beggar, but Job knows that this attack is going to happen. Tells his doormaid to tell him he cannot help him. He keeps knocking, gives him a burnt loaf of bread. The doormaid feels embarrassed, not knowing that it's Satan that's a beggar, to give him the bread. Tries to give him one of her own loaves that are not burned, but then gets called out by Satan on this. And then it goes through talking about how Job had always been so pious and been faithful and generous in all that he has, and listing of everything he had, but how he used everything he had. Like he talks about all the the sheep, and then he designated 7,000 to be sheared for clothing of orphans, widows, the poor, and the helpless. And he made sure that they were all protected. He also talks about how he always had 7 tables ready to feed people in his hospitality for the stranger, and had food always ready. He underwrote many charities. So it's really speaking about how generous of a man Job was prior to this. But then it goes into the sadness of when he loses everything, his children and all of his wealth and his livelihood, and he is mourning, and then his health is attacked, which we'll cover in the second chapter here. But it really just talks about and paints a picture of how, in spite of all his generosity prior to this, he is now he's now destitute, and how his wife Sidis struggles to provide for him in this, where just getting bread to feed him, and all of these, with every bit of the losses, and his children, and his heart is broken, and he is sitting on a dung heap out of town, and he's also now, and then his health is attacked, which we're going to cover again, like I said earlier. And for 48 years he sat in this heap mourning and praying for God's restoration of himself and God to justify him, which is really, you think about it, I spent 48 years on the dung heap outside the city under the plague, so I saw with my own eyes my children, my first wife, carrying water in the house of a certain nobleman as a maidservant, so she might have bread and bring it to me. I was stunned. I said, the gall of these city fathers, how can they treat my wife like a female slave? And then he calls out on that, and then another 11 years they kept even bread itself from me, barely allowing her to have enough of her own food. And then Satan tricks her to sell her hair, and then tells this line, which we're going to cover here. So let's look at Job, and let's read what it says here. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, from where have you come? Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down on it. And the Lord said to Satan, how have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil? He still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him. See, the Testament of Job, and it tries to explain that, is where God did give permission, but had a plan to be able to restore him. But Satan is not able to do anything without permission. I mean, God is all powerful. Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on earth? So he still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, skin for skin, all that a man has he will give for his life. But stretch out your hand and touch his bone and flesh, and he will curse you to your face. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, he is in your hand, only spare his life. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his feet to the crown of his head. And he took a piece of broken pottery with which to scrape himself while he sat in the ashes. So here we see this image here. He's being attacked. Satan, and this is what the Testament of Job also says. It keeps to the tradition on there, and understanding that God would not allow Satan to take his life, but he could take his comfort. He could take everything away from him but his life. And so here he's under attack. He's sitting on the dung heap or a garbage pit, and he's got all these sores. So he's just awful. Technically, in that he couldn't be in the presence of any good, faithful person because, of course, of the sores that he would have. He's unclean. His wife in this, who gets a one line, and we don't even know her name in this. Now, she's given a name in the story from the Testament of Job, but his wife said, do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. But he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women would speak. As one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive from God good from God, and shall we not receive evil? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. So we have the beginnings of this story of Job, and we know from here he's a man of integrity. His wife is of course mourning and weeping. She's a very tragic figure if you really think about this, because not only has she lost all of her wealth and comfort, she's lost her children, which is her hope from her womb. And she probably at this point was like, what? I can't bear any more children to you. And then we come and we find her at the point he's staying firm. He's got sores, so she's lost her husband also because he is now ill and is outside. There's no honor to him anymore because he has these sores on him, and she's just fed up. Curse God and die. Quit holding this integrity, she says. Now, we could say that's very cruel and truly it is an appalling thing, but we also have to, there is some part of us that sometimes we don't think of just the amount of suffering that she was facing also at the time. And why, what had she done? She had done nothing truly to deserve this. Now we look at this. Now some would argue, I know here, if I look on the notes here, there are those that would argue that the type of literature this is myth, because it has all supernatural events, and then we have the story. We look at it as the whole bit of it is prose. It's written in it's a poetic writing. Now, we don't know who Job truly was, but I do believe Job was a person who faced calamity and suffering, but also was a man of great faith, that God inspired to write a story, that God inspired the writer to carry his story and write it down. I'm sure his story was carried through in the traditions prior to it being written down. But there's also there's a great bit we can learn from this. I for one am one that I truly pull back from speaking of biblical accounts as being myth, simply because when you think of a myth, the ultimate idea of a myth is it's not true. So I would argue here, because I'm going to put that back over here, because I'm one who struggles when they speak of everything as myth. And I know that was partially what I was taught in seminary, but there are others that other traditions and things that speak differently of this. Of course, I would say this is more of like the tale of an epic writing that you would find within cultures, Near Eastern cultures, where there is insight that's being given that would naturally or normally be given, but I would argue that insight was inspired by the power of the Holy Spirit, God's revelation. But we find in here, and this is one thing that I find in both of the accounts here, both in the Testament of Job and which is not a biblical writing. It's extra biblical in that sense. It's not something that is authoritative in any way, shape, or form within our faith, and I don't want to assume anyone to assume, but it is also an account that basically helps to give insight into the thinker, those of us that were thinking, and some of the stuff that might have been shared at the time throughout generations before it was written down in the Greek. That may have been carried out but never carried as being a full story, but trying to also understand who Job was and seeing him as a real-life person that did live and have a great amount of suffering and struggled, but God took away, but God gave back in the essence. It blessed him again. So he had a second blessing. It's not a replacement of all that he had, but he was blessed once again, so that he wasn't one that was caught up in great mourning. Ultimately, personally, I would hope that his wife was able to, his first wife that witnessed all this great suffering, was able to take part in the second blessing, just for her own sake, so she could see that that she did not die thinking God hated her. But here we enter into the next part of this as we move with Job, where Job's in his great period of mourning, and three friends come to see him. In of course the Testament of Job, these are three kings, and basically Job is seen as a kingly person, also a man of high repute, high estate. But here's his friends. They come and they hear of all this evil that had come upon him. They came each from his own place: Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They made an appointment together to come to show him sympathy and comfort. And when they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him. And they raised their voices and wept, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven. And they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights. And no one spoke word to him, for they saw that his suffering was great. One could argue when you look at a lot of what you see here is these three friends, this is the greatest ministry that they could have done. And actually, if they had stopped here, their ministry would have not been diminished in any way, shape, or form. It's a great model of understanding when we see great suffering. Sometimes it's not helpful to go and try and find answers as to why something is happening as it's happening. It's better to try and find something, be able to just sit with them and maybe not even just hold your tongue, bite your tongue. If you have nothing to offer that's beneficial, it's probably better not to say anything at all. And that, I think, is really ultimately the great lesson we can find within this second chapter here. We already know with Sidis, as she, as I'm sharing with her in the stories that go beyond, she's gone through great suffering. And quite honestly, if you have a chance, if you want to read it, it is you see the tragedy, because here Sidis is really lamenting everything that she had lost, all the place that she had, but she was a faithful wife who came to be with her, to care for her husband, actually gave everything for her, or for his sake also, because he didn't receive any of kindness from any of his neighbors, as what we would find as we read in the Testament of Job. And in all reality, the greatest kindness that we do find when you read Job, the book of Job, the biblical book of Job, is this 7 days and 7 nights, where basically what happens is each of his friends, they take a space in this, and they offer the greatest thing they can, because they suffer with him, in essence. They take upon their great grief of seeing their friend who is unrecognizable suffering, so they step up and they tear their cloaks, they put ash on their head, and they sit and they mourn with him. They just mourn what has been lost. They mourn the loss of his health. They mourn the loss of all of his things and his family. And they grieve with him for these 7 days and 7 nights. That's the greatest gift that they can give. And honestly, when we are seeing our friends and loved ones struggle, that can often be the greatest gift that we can give to them, is just to mourn with them, not to try and explain the great amount of suffering, to think that that's going to help them feel better. Because the reality is, you lose everything, you lose a loved one, you lose all these things. There's really nothing you can say that's going to be helpful other than, I love you, I'm sorry, I ache for you, and God still loves you. It's not like God's looking down and saying he hates you, because see, God didn't hate Job. He didn't turn his back on Job. He didn't. Now, for Job, in this, he clung to his faith. Were there things that he said that we find that he shouldn't have? Yeah, out of frustration. But God also rebukes him for it. But at the same time, he rebukes these three friends, which we'll go through too. Because, and even the fourth that does come, that's not really his friend later on. But ultimately, the greatest lesson to take as we open up the book of Job is we look at a person who had every reason to turn away from God, but still doesn't. And then, even in the midst of this, he doesn't turn away from God. He actually, we find there's some great hope that he professes, and even in this, he's trying to teach his friends about the love of God, and saying that God, things happen. And the reality that we have to realize as Christians, as we can walk this path, is suffering happens. We're going to suffer in this earth. There's no guarantee that everything is always going to go well for us just because we believe and trust in God. Even if we do everything right and make the right decisions and right choices and actually say the right things and are professing it, that doesn't mean that we won't fall under attack. In fact, we might actually fall under greater attack because we're challenging Satan. We're challenging the devil. We're challenging his territory, and that's going to happen. So sometimes it's better for us as Christians to take a step back in the midst of the suffering of our friends, in the midst of the suffering of others, and to just pray. Pray with them. Spend time in prayer with them. Weep with them. Really feel, let their grief be in you also. Because just because we know we have the hope of Jesus Christ doesn't mean that we can't feel grief. We can't weep. We can't feel sadness. Ultimately, we don't want that sadness to overtake us. We don't want that grief to overwhelm us because we have hope. We don't grieve as those without hope. We don't mourn as those without hope. We don't need to be wailing and carrying on and on and on about anything because we have hope. We have the hope in Jesus Christ. And really in Job we find that he points to Christ also, because as we read the scriptures we find that ultimately God is pointing us to the salvation that we receive in Jesus Christ. And there is such a great picture here. Job is not Christ, but he is a Christ figure in the essence of he is one who takes upon an undeserved suffering. But in the end, there's a greater blessing that will be found. And that is ultimately where we move. That is ultimately where we're called to go. And that is the blessing of Job. So I'm hoping you're enjoying this. I remember when I studied this in seminary, this was one of those books I really enjoyed to study. And in sense, I had a great professor that I did study under. She's spoken even with the North American Lutheran Church on this. Catherine Schifferdecker. She actually is very well respected, I guess, in many circles because of her work that she's done in studying Job. And I thought she opened many. And I remember when I shared with her some of the insights that I received when I actually found the Testament of Job first, and how it was fascinating to look at in this and to understand and study. Ultimately, looking at the person of Job, there's many we could find in ourselves sometimes of some of that suffering. Hopefully, if we walk in a faithful way, realizing that even the most faithful of people will meet suffering, will meet grief, will meet pain, and we look at Job as a great example of someone who suffered and struggled. And he didn't always say the right thing. He wasn't perfect in any way, shape, or form. Only one in all of history, one person in all of history has faced suffering and has been perfect through it all. And that's Jesus Christ, because he is the only one that did not sin at all on the cross or in the midst of his suffering or anything of that nature. But we can also see in the midst of suffering, there's always hope. There's always hope that God is there and he will provide something more. It's not saying he'll provide like Job, we lose everything and then God will all of a sudden give us everything back plus. No, but not in this world, not in an earthly sense, but in the spiritual sense, temporal sense, I would say yes. We actually get a greater abundance of anything we could ever lose here on earth in our Lord Jesus Christ, when we are called to be at his side, when we are called home to our eternal home. We will have greater riches than what we could ever imagine here on this side of eternity. But that's neither here nor there, in the sense of it's not going to be the same as what we would think of here as being very wealthy or rich. It's not a temporal understanding of riches. And that's really ultimately what we want to think about as we continue on through Job. Now, I'm hoping that that anybody who is seeing this, if you enjoy this, I hope you will share it. If you have any questions or anything, email right there. My pastor Chris at goodshepherdlcmc.org. Or you can comment on the post and let me know what you think. But I hope you enjoy this, and I hope to have you again joining me for future episodes that will come up as I put these together weekly here as we go deeper into the Word. And I'm thinking Job is a good place to start, and especially as we look at our world today. Because even in the greatest and the most dark of moments, there is always hope. We have the hope in our Lord and our Savior, Jesus Christ, and may that give you peace. And until next time, you have yourself a great and glorious week.